Masechet Kiddushin Daf Chaf Bet. We are going to complete our discussion of Eved Ivri and begin the next Mishnah, which is about Eved Kena'ani. Tenor Banan. Im Amor Yomar Ad Yomar V'Yishne. If a Eved Ivri wants to extend his stay as an Ayabed after the 6 years. So he says to the master, right? If he says to the master, I love my master, I love my wife, I love my children, meaning that that's the Shivcha Kana'anit and that the master gives him and the children that he has with her, which if he stays as a slave, he can stay with them. If he goes free, then he will not stay with them because they will remain slaves and he will go free. So if he says, I love you and my wife and the kids and I want to stay. So since it says Amor Yomar with a double verb, Braita teaches that he has to say it twice to make sure he really means it. And if he says it once, maybe he'll change his mind. Saying it twice, he's confirming, yes, indeed. Like when you confirm your password, right? Is this really your password? Amar betchilat shesh v'lo amar besof shesh eno nirsa shene'emar lo eseh hafshi ad sheyomar b'shat yesi'ah. If he says it at the beginning of 6 and didn't say it at the end of 6, we're going to discuss what does it mean the beginning of 6. Does it mean the beginning of the 6th year? Right now we're assuming it means the beginning of his servitude, all the way at the beginning, like in year 1. So if he said it at the beginning, already at the start, he says, "Oh, I love this job. I want to stay after 6 years," and he didn't repeat it at the end. No good, because it says, Lo echseh chofshi, I don't want to go free. So if he's saying I don't want to go free, it means he's saying it at the time that he is about to go free. If it's beforehand, way too long beforehand, then that's not the time of going free. It wouldn't make sense to say I don't want to go free unless he's about to go free. Okay, so therefore he definitely has to say something at the end. Amar besof elo amar betchilat shesh eno nirsa. If he says it only at the end, again, he has to say it twice. If it's only at the end and not in the beginning, and again, we're going to talk about what beginning means, but right now we're assuming beginning means all the way at the beginning. Eno nirsa, not good enough. Shene'emar yomar yomar ha'ayabed ad sheyomar keshehu ayabed. So if he says it only at the end, meaning after he finishes being a slave, like after sunset of his last day, and he didn't say it beforehand, also eno nirsa, because if the pasuk says, if the slave says, he has to declare this while he's still a slave. He could only extend his servitude while he's a slave. If he already went free, then there's no possibility of going back. That's the Braita. Let's analyze to see exactly what these time periods mean. Amar mor, amar betchilat shesh velo amar besof shesh eno nirsa. Shene'emar lo eseh chofshi. So the master mentioned in the Braita that if he says at the beginning, I want to stay, but he didn't repeat it at the end of 6, then not nirsa because it says, I don't want to go free. So therefore it has to be when he's about to go free. So it has to be near the end, not earlier. Now, what now the question is, why do you have to learn it from this pasuk? I don't want to go free, that has to be near the freedom. We could learn it from a different pasuk. Since he says, I love my master, my wife, and my children. Wait a second, at the beginning of his servitude, let's say, day 1, he doesn't have children yet. It's got to be at least 9 months until he will have a child. So why don't we learn from there that doesn't work when you say it at the beginning of the 6? That's question 1. Vetu, 2 in Arabic means furthermore, but it could also work in English. And 2, second question. Amar besof shesh velo amar betchilat shesh eno nirsa shene'emar ha'ayebed atu sof shesh lav ayebed hu. That the Braita says, if he only said, I want to go free at the end of 6, but not in the beginning of 6, not nirsa, because it says the slave. He has to say it while he's a slave. Wait a second. At the end of 6, isn't he still a slave? The Braita didn't say after 6. It says at the end of 6. So that also can't understand that phrase either. So to answer all the questions, Amar Rava, my betchilat shesh, betchilat peruta harona, my besof shesh, besof peruta harona. Rava explains when it says the beginning of 6 and end of 6, it's not all the way in the beginning. It's not after the end of 6. It means the very last moments. The last Shaveh Peruta. So as follows, let's say, right, sunset is at 6 o'clock on that day. That's when he's about to go free. Now, what's a piruta's worth of his work? In other words, that he went down to the last few moments, such that if he wanted to redeem himself, all he would have to pay is a piruta. So if you do the calculation and you find that a piruta's worth of work would be 2 minutes, right? The last 2 minutes, 6:58, 5:58, 5:59, and then he would go free. So what does this mean in the Braita, that he has to repeat it twice at the beginning and the end? It means at the beginning of that last piruta, he has to say it while there is still a piruta left of work to do. He has to say, I want to go free, right? Because at that point, he is, in fact, still a slave. And then he has to say it again after that, at 6:59, when there's even less than a piruta left, because that will fulfill the pasuk, Lo eseh chofshi, sheyomar b'shat yitziah. He has to say it at the moment he's about to become free. At that point, right, it's even less than a piruta. You can't even divide that point any further. So it can't be after he is already free. Then you can't go back. But this is the point at which not even a piruta, he's about to go free. And he says it again, so that's the 2 times to fulfill both. He's saying it, Yomad ha'eved, he is a slave, but also, Lo eseh chofshi, I don't want to go free. What we're going to see in this and the following derashot is that you see that the rabbis really do not want people to extend slavery. It's bad enough that a person has sold himself or was sold into slavery. Really, we don't like slavery. The Torah doesn't like it. It limits it. And then the rabbis add these derashot to make it like almost impossible, right? In order to extend, you have to be there at that exact moment and say it once and say it twice within those couple of minutes or however long you calculate it's going to be. All right, you miss that chance, you sneeze, and then you might lose out on that possibility of extending slavery, and that seems to be some of the purpose of these derashot. Tenor Rabbanan, Lo isha banim ulrabo en isha banim en on nirsa shneimar ki ahevecha ve'et betecha. Let's say the slave has a wife and children, meaning with the shivcha Kanaanit, and he has children with the shivcha Kanaanit, so he has a family within as a slave. But the master does not have a wife and a slave. He cannot extend his servitude, because it says, the slave says, I love you and your house. House means your wife, your family. I love being with you and your family. If the owner doesn't have a family, then he cannot fulfill that word. And the other way around, if the master has a wife and children, good, so he could say, but if the slave himself is not married to a shivcha, it's not marriage, it's given over to, it says isha. But if he doesn't have a shivcha Kanaanit and he doesn't have children with her, then also he cannot extend his servitude, because it says, I love my master, and this is the first pasuk was in Devarim, this one is in Shemot, and I love my wife and my children. Only if he has that excuse, I love my wife and my children, so I want to stay a slave, so I can stay with this shivcha Kanaanit and the children that we bore together. Only then. But if he doesn't have children there in slavery, then there's no reason for him to stay. He cannot extend. If he loves the master, but the master doesn't love him back, the master doesn't love the slave too much, also he cannot extend, because the pasuk says that he is well with you, meaning that's good for both of you. With you like him and he likes you, but in this case it's not mutual. If the owner loves the slave but the slave does not love the master, also he cannot have his ear pierced and extend, because it says if he loves you. In this case he doesn't. The slave doesn't love the owner. If the slave is sick and the master is well, can't be nirsa, because it says kitob lo has to be good for him, right? If they find that the slave is good for him with you, he's not well, so it's not good for him. The other way around, if the owner is sick and the slave is well, also cannot be a nirsa, because it says imach, with you, meaning that you have to be the same. And so even though the slave is well, but that's not the same status as the owner, so not imach. There you go. This is like reminiscent of the Ben Sorer Moreh, where the two parents have to be exactly the same. They have to look the same and sound the same, the same height and so on, right? And making it almost impossible to ever have a Ben Sorer Moreh. Here also, that there's a lot of qualifications that have to happen in order for someone to be able to extend his servitude. A last question: what if both of them are ill, the owner and the slave? Do we say imach? He has to be the same as you, and they are the same. So, right, they're both equally good or equally bad. So, yes, he can extend. Or do we say kitob lo imach? They have to both be equal and both be good, both be well. And here they're both sick, so therefore you cannot take. Oh, that's a good question. We leave that standing. תנו רבנן, כי טוב לו עמך, עמך במאכל, עמך במשתה, שלא תהיה אתה אוכל פת נקייה והוא אוכל פת קיבר, אתה שותה יין ישן, והוא שותה יין חדש, אתה ישן על גבי מוחין, והוא ישן על גבי תבן. מכאן אמרו, כל הקונה עבד עברי, כקונה אדון לעצמו. We learned further, we saw this Rasha already quoted before. Here's the main place. It says that he should be well with you. The slave should be have a good lifestyle with you, the same as you. Peshat is that he should fare well while he's living with you. But we already saw that the Rasha Imach means not just while he's with you, but actually equal level. So the same with food, the same in drink. Whatever you're drinking, he drinks. So that you should not be eating. The owner shouldn't be eating very fine bread, and the slave is eating inferior bread. You are drinking old wine, fine wine, and he's drinking new wine, grape juice. You are sleeping on nice, comfortable, soft sheets, and he's sleeping on straw. Not good. He has to be the same as you. Because of this, the rabbis taught that anyone who acquires a Hebrew slave is actually acquiring a master for himself, because the master always has to make sure, is everything okay with the slave? Do you have enough to eat? Do you have enough to drink? Let me get you something else. Let me get you some bedding. So really, you have to take care of the slave. I had an experience like that. We once had a baby nurse, and baby nurse, right, she was very particular about where she slept and what she ate. We made dinner ourselves for us, and said, come and join and eat some of the dinner. She says, no, this is not good enough for me. I need you to pay for me to go out to eat. So that she wanted a level even higher than our own food and our own drink. We ended up having to do so much work to make her happy, more than she was helping with the baby. So she didn't last too long. Okay, Tinora Banan. Ve'yasa me'imachu ubanav imo, amar Rabbi Shimon, imhu nimkar banav ubnotav, mi nimkarim. There's a pasuk here in Vayikra in the context of if your own brother becomes poor and is sold to you, so Ebed Ivri, right? He will leave in the Yovel year. It says Ve'yasam me'imachu ubanav imo. He will leave from you, him, and his children. So now we're wondering, what do you mean, his children? If he got sold into slavery, okay, we understand. His children aren't sold into slavery with him. So what does this mean? That his children also go free? We learn from here that a master is obligated to provide food for his children. After all, if the father is sold into slavery, who's going to take care of his children? So this is part of an obligation. So this is even more, right, than we said above. Not only does the master have to provide food and clothing and bedding and drink for the slave, he has to provide for the slave's children as well. And then in the Yovel, he goes free. The children also leave from under the responsibility of the owner, that the owner had to feed them this whole time. Similarly, this is in Shemot, also regarding Eved Ivri. Right, after 6 years, he goes free. If he was married, his wife goes free with him. So we ask the same question. I understand that he was sold. Was his wife sold, that you should say she goes free? No, rather, if someone is married, and he becomes a slave, so then the master is obligated to provide sustenance for his wife all the time that he is a slave. Now I need both of these teachings regarding sons and children and regarding wife. If you only tell me the law regarding children, I would say, yeah, the master has to provide for his slaves' children because they are not capable of going to work and eat. They're children. They can't go get a job. But his wife, she can go get some job, make enough money to feed herself. So then you could say the master is not obligated. So that's why I have to learn the law regarding the master. And the other way around, if you only said that the wife, that he has to provide for her, that's because it's not the regular way of an adult have to go around begging. Usually most adults, they could go get some kind of job, at least enough to pay for their own food. But children, where it's more common for them to have to go begging, I might have thought that the master has to provide only for the wife, but not for the children. And that's why I need both of these teachings, that if someone is sold into slavery, the master has to provide both for his wife and for his children all the time that he is a slave, to provide sustenance for them. Tenor Rabbanan, ilu ne'emar ozno badelet, hayit omer yidkor keneged ozno badelet, delet in ozno la. We want to figure out exactly how is his ear pierced. You see this pasuk, there's two pasukim that talk about it. Here's one in Shemot. It says, if I want to stay, Higisho Adonav Elohim, that means he brings him to the judges. The master brings the slave, and the master brings the slave close to the door or the doorpost. And he pierces his ear there with an awl, and then he will be his slave forever. It's not clear what's the connection here between bringing him close to the door or the doorpost, and then there he will pierce his ear. It just has to do it near the doorpost. What's the connection between the piercing of the ear and the door and the doorpost? Not, we have to figure that out. Furthermore, in the pasuk here in Devarim, it says, here you have to take the awl and put it through his ear and the door. It doesn't say doorpost, there's door here, and then Eved Olam. So let's try to figure out how he put together all these pasukim. We say, if the pasuk had said his ear on the door, then I would say that you have to make a hole on the door near where his ear is. Like you put his ear near the door, see the height where it would end up, and then make a hole only in the door, but not in the ear, right? So, yes, door, but not in the ear. So we say, hold on. Even if the pasuk had said that, we're making a theoretical. Would you not actually pierce the ear? It says you pierce his ear with it all. Okay, so for sure you have to pierce his ear. Rather, let's modify. If it said ozno and then en badelet, I would have thought you pierce his ear outside, far away, anywhere, right, out in the field. And then after you do that, you bring the slave close to the door, and then you make a hole in the door near where the ear, at the height of where the ear is, and you do it to the door. So it's two separate actions, a hole in the ear, and then a hole in the door near where the ear is when you bring his ear close to the door. So Talmud Lomar be'ozno ubadelet. So that can't be, because the Pasukim Devarim puts it together. In other words, if you had only Shemot, it sounds like there's two separate actions, pierce his ear and pierce the door. But in Devarim, they're together, ozno and delet. So how do you do that? Hakesad doker veholech ad shemagia etzel delet. Rather means you bring him close to the door, put his ear onto flush up against the door, and you pierce his ear. You put the awl through the ear, and you keep going until you get to the door, so that you're going to make at least an indentation in the door at the same time while his ear while the awl is through his ear. Delet shemani ben akura ben she'ena akura. Now when it says door, a door could be a door that's detached. It's just a door that's sitting there, leaning on the wall. So does it mean whether it's detached or attached? That's why it says doorpost, that just like a doorpost is upright, connected, so too a door has to be upright and attached to the doorpost. That solves the ambiguity that in Devarim just says door, and Shemot it says door or doorpost, saying has to be a door that's connected to a doorpost. Good. רבן יוחנן בן זכאי היה דורש את המקרא הזה כמין חומר, מה נשתנה אוזן מכל האיברים שבגוף? אמר הקדוש ברוך הוא, אוזן ששמע קולי על הר סיני בשעה שאמרתי כי לי בני ישראל עבדים ולא עבדים לעבדים, והלך זה וקנה אדון לעצמו ירסה. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai used to make a derasha like a homer. What does that mean? Some say it means like a packet of something that smells good. That's a nice tight packet, kind of like like a glove fits the hand. He said something that fits the words so nicely. It could also mean homer is like Homer, like in other words, like a parable, like a Greek parable. So he interpreted this in a parabolic way. Okay, whatever that means. So he says, why the ear? He's trying to explain this very strange ritual. Why are we piercing his ear rather than any other limb of the body? So this is the reason. Hashem said, your ear that heard on Har Sinai, even though this person is many generations later, so not that they were literally on Har Sinai, but all the Bnei Israel collectively were at Har Sinai, so it obligates everyone. So this at Matan Torah, we were all told, Kili Bnei Israel Abadim, that Bnei Israel are Abadim to Hashem, and not slaves to slaves. Now this is actually not in the Ten Commandments, but it's similar. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I took you out of Egypt, right? Out of being slaves, and therefore this is a corollary that you are my slaves. So therefore we are supposed to be servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly, which is an honor to be a servant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a master who looks out for our own good, always. And so that's the ideal life, and we should not be servants to servants. So if I am a slave to someone else, that person is a servant to Kadosh Baruch Hu, and now I'm going to make myself a slave to a human being. Hashem didn't want that. Hashem took us out from being slaves to human beings. And this guy goes and acquires a master for himself. Let his ear be pierced because he's not listening, right? He's not paying attention to that what his ears heard at Har Sinai. He is going against this directive, and therefore his ear deserves to be punished. Your ear who heard that commandment, you went against it anyway. So, right, let this be a lesson to your ear, and hopefully you will listen in the future and not be a slave to a slave. This derasha takes on added significance when we know about the Hammurabi Code, which said, if a slave runs away and then he's caught and he says, no, you are not my master. In other words, he denies that his master is his master. He says, no, you will never own me. And then the judges will look into it. If they find that the slave was lying, and really this is his master, then his punishment is his ear gets cut off. So first of all, that's a lot more gory, cutting off an ear versus just piercing an ear. Secondly, it's actually the opposite. The whole point is the opposite. There, if a slave tries to run away, then we cut off his ear because he's not listening to his master. He tried to deny that he is a slave, so he gets punished in this way. Here we punish the guy by having his ear pierced if he continues to be a slave and he wants to stay. There is a similarity, however, in that the point is the same, that both of them are not listening to their master. The difference is, in the Hammurabi Code, he's not listening to his human master, and so his ear gets cut off. Over here, a person is not listening to his divine master. Hashem said, you are my servants, you should not be slaves to a human being. You didn't listen to that. So in that sense, he is denying God as his master, so he deserves to have his ear pierced. Okay, that's a beautiful derasha by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Furthermore, Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi haya doresh et hamikra hazeh kimin homer ma nishtana delet muzah mikol kelim shebabayit. Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi, would make the derasha in the following pasuk also like homer. Also like either that decorative wreath that fits so nicely, or in a Homeric style, which was the epitome of beautiful poetry and parable. at the time. So he says, what's the difference? Why a door or a door post? Why not appearances here against the wall, against the table, on the floor? Why a door? אמר הקדוש ברוך הוא, דלת מזוזה שיהודים במצרים, בשעה שפסחתי על המשקוף על שתי המזוזות, ואמרתי, כי לי בני אצל עבדים, ולא עבדים לעבדים, ועשיתי מעבדות לחירות, והלך זה, וקנה אדון לעצמו, ירסה בפניהם. Hashem says, this door and door post that were my witnesses in Egypt when I skipped over the doorpost and the lintels of those in Egypt who were Israelites, and I said, I will not punish them. They're exempt from Akat Bechorot because they are my slaves, and they should not be slaves to slaves. And now I took them out from slavery to freedom, and this guy goes back and he makes himself a slave. Let him go. Bring those witnesses back, the door and the doorpost that I skipped over and protected them at that time. And you know what? If you wanted to be a slave, I shouldn't have protected you, right? This door and doorpost, they are the witnesses. Let them come testify against you. Very, very powerful derasha. Very beautiful. All right, next Mishnah. עבד כנעני נקנה בכסף בשטר ובחזקה וקונה את עצמו בכסף על ידי אחרים ובשטר על ידי עצמו דברי רבי מאיר. עבד כנעני, there's different laws from עבד עברי. You go out into war and you capture some עבד כנעני, or however you capture them, and you want to acquire them. They have to be acquired legally. It could be through money, by buying them on the slave market, or by a shtar, right? You give it just like you'd buy land with a shtar, or chazakah, taking possession of him. In other words, using him like a slave. The same way with land. If you start digging the land, right, you're showing that your ownership over it. So you have a slave do some work for you. Now, this Eved Kanani can acquire his freedom also with kesef by others. In other words, someone else comes and pays the owner to free the slave. So he can acquire his freedom that way. Or with the shtar by himself. If the master gives a shtar to the slave himself, then he goes free. That's according to the Bi Meir. Hachamim, however, אומרים בכסף על ידי עצמו ובשטר על ידי אחרים בלבד שיהיה כסף משל אחרים. Hachamim disagree and they say the other way around. Money he can acquire on his own. In other words, the slave himself can give money to the master. The complication is if a slave goes and finds $100 in the street and picks it up, it's not his, so that he can then give it to the master, because the rule is that anything a slave acquires is acquired by the master. The slave is an extension of the master's own hand. So therefore, right, this is the problem. How could a slave ever get money in order to pay for his freedom? That's why the Bi Meir says, no, someone else will have to pay for his freedom. However, Chachamim say, as long as he does it from others, money belonging to others. So the idea is that someone else would have to give him money and say, here, I'm giving you, slave, this money on condition that it does not go to your master, so it's yours only, and then the master can give it, and that will work. But regarding a shtar, Chachamim say the opposite. The shtar, the owner would have to give to someone else in order for the slave to go free. Because if he gives it to the slave himself, then anything the slave gets goes automatically to the master. The Gemara will discuss all these cases further. We start off with the three ways that a Eved Kanani is acquired. Min elan, how do you know? Tichtiv itnachatem otam libnechem acharechem lareshet achuza. Hikishana katub liste achuza. Maste achuza nikne bekesef b'shtar b'chazaka. If Eved Kanani nikne bekesef b'shtar b'chazaka. It says regarding Eved Kanani that you will bequeath him to your children after you, right, as an inheritance. So we make this is similar compared to an ancestral land. Just like with an ancestral land, how do you acquire ancestral land? With money. I could buy land from you. With a shtar, we can write a shtar of acquisition. Or I can go and use your land, and once I start using it as an owner, then that effectuates the transaction and becomes mine. So to Eved Kanani in the same three ways, because they are connected in this pasuk. Hold on, if you're going to compare the two, let's continue the comparison and say, just like an ancestral land goes back to the original owner at the Yovel, maybe Eved Kanani, let's say I owned one and I sold it to you before the Yovel comes, does it go back to me? No. You will that you can make them work for you forever, meaning a sale is permanent and it does not go back. Okay, so that's the three ways. But now we have a Baraita that adds one to the Mishnah, Tana'ah bechalifin. You can also acquire a slave with symbolic exchange. So let's say I want to buy a slave from you. So I can give you a handkerchief, and then you, by taking the handkerchief, transfer ownership of the slave to me. So this is yet another way of acquiring a slave. So now we wonder, Tana Didan, the author of our Mishnah, said only three ways. What about Chalipin? How come he didn't include it? Surely that would be a good way to acquire a slave. Milta deleta b'metaltelin katane. Milta dita b'metaltelin la katane. Oh, the author of our Mishnah wasn't giving an exhaustive list of every way to acquire a slave. Rather, well, he was just listing the ways that you can do it that don't work for a movable object. But something that works for a movable object, he did not include. In other words, movable objects generally can be acquired by moving them, since they're movable. So you may as well. So that if I go to a store and I pay for something, or over there, that's say behind the counter. So first I pay for it, but I didn't take it yet. It's not yet mine. So they'll say it gets suddenly gets destroyed. I'm not responsible because it's not mine until I actually pick it up or move it. That's metaltelin. But land, since you can't move land, so land is acquired through the three means that we just mentioned, by kesef, by shtad, or by hazakah. So the Tanav, our Mishnah, wanted to let us know that these are the three ways that a slave can be acquired. That's the same as land. But that's something that you can use for land or for movable objects. It did not include, but in fact, our Tana would agree that chalipin can be used for both. Chalipin can be used for land or for movable objects, and yes, can be used for a slave. Good. Amar Shemuel, Ebed Kanani nikne b'mshicha kesa tekafo ba'aslo kena'o kena'o ba'aslo lo kena'o. Shemuel says that an Ebed Kanani is acquired by pulling him. How do you do that? You grab him and pull him, right? Then, so it's kind of like the same as a movable object. If I want to acquire this fruit, I have to actually move it. And so same thing with the slave. However, if I call his name, right, and I say, slave, come over here, and he comes, that does not work. Why? Because he came of his own free will, right? I called him, he didn't have to come. So I actually have to physically pull him in order to acquire. So now, we ask about this, about Shemuel. We understand why the author of our Mishnah did not include Meshicha, even though they may very well agree that Meshicha works, because we already established that only things that any way of acquisition that can be used for movable objects, the author of the Mishnah did not include. Only if it's something that you cannot use for movable objects, it included. That's why it has only kesef shtar and chazakah. But the Tana of the Braita that included kinyan halipin, so why not also include meshicha? Once you're including things that can be used for movable objects, so it include meshicha also, which is for movable objects. And we answer that, Ki katan milta di'ita ben b'mekarkeh ben metalteleh. Now the author of that Braita only wanted to list things that can be used both for land and for movable objects, that's chalipin. Meshicha de metaltelehita mekarkeh leta la katane, but didn't want to include in his list things that can be used for movable objects, but not for land, and that would be pulling something is only good for movable objects and not for land, but they may very well all agree that all five of these ways of acquiring can work for an Eved Kana'ani. Now let's analyze Shemuel's statement further. Kesad tekafo ba'as lo kena'o, kena'o ba'as lo kena'o. If you pull him, that's a good acquisition. If you call him and he comes not, ukra'o lo, really? If you call him, it's no good. Vatanya kesad b'msida achaza betalpa bisara be'ukav shaleha bishalif shaleha be'frum biya shebefiha bezog shebesavara kena'a. We're comparing now acquiring Eved Kanani to acquiring an animal. Not a very nice comparison, but still, in this legal realm of acquiring people, in some ways, there's overlap and similarity to acquiring an animal. So, the Baraita says, how is an animal acquired? If you grab it by its hoof, its hair, the saddle, the load that's on it, the bit in its mouth, the belt on its neck, all that is a way of acquiring the animal. Kesad b'mshicha. How can it be? That's misira, through passing it. But how about pulling it? If you call the animal, right, you say, come here, and it comes, then that's an acquisition for an animal. Or if you hit it with a stick and it runs in front of him, and once it lifts its front leg and its hind leg, that's considered an acquisition. Not just one leg, but has to move two legs, and that's it. It's yours. This will make a big difference if even if you paid for it, that doesn't make the acquisition happen. But rather only once you do this. So such that if it suddenly drops dead right before that, then I get money back. If it drops dead after I move it, then it's my loss. Rabbi and some say Rabbi Acha say it's not enough if it just picks up 2 feet, and actually has to walk the distance of its height. And only then is it acquired. So here's the question. You just said that regarding Eved Kanani, if I call him, come over here, and he comes, it's not an acquisition. But for an animal, if you call it and it comes, then it is an acquisition. So why? What's the difference? And the answer is, Amri behema da'ata demara azla, ayebeda da'ata denafshe ka'azla ka'azil. An animal is moving by the will of its owner. Someone calls him, that's why it's moving. It doesn't have a mind of its own. It's just an automatic thing. You hear someone say, come here, it comes. Whereas a slave walks by his own will. Even though he's a slave, but nevertheless, he can decide whether he wants to walk or not. So that's not an act of acquisition, because he could decide not to walk, and so it doesn't work. A rough sentence to say out loud, but in the legal sense, a slave who is a minor is like an animal, in the sense that if you call over an animal, it just comes. It's not thinking for itself. So to a minor, doesn't have enough mental capacity to make decisions on his own, and therefore, if you call over a child, in order to acquire him as an Eved Kana'ani, he just comes on his own. He's not going to have a mind enough to think that I do want to or don't want to walk over, and therefore you can acquire a child as an Eved Kana'ani just by calling him over. Tenora banan kesad behazaka. How does it work to use a slave? What do you have to do in order to show that he is yours by usage? Hitil lo min alo ohlich kelav acharav lebet hamelchas ifshito hirchaiso sacho gerdo hilbisho hanilo higbiho kenao. Sounds like a poem. Okay, if a slave removes his master's shoes, carries his garments after him to the bathhouse, undresses him, bathes him, anoints him, scrubs the oil off of him. This is how they used to get themselves clean in the bathhouse. They didn't take showers very often, so there was often a thick layer of dirt that would be accumulate on their skin, so they'd have to put oil over him and then use a scraper to scrape off the skin. You see here that someone who was rich enough to have a slave, he would sit there and relax while the slave did this. Dresses him, puts his shoes back on, or lifts him. It lifts him like, let's say an aid for an elderly person who can't get up on his own. And so the slave would pick him up. That's all. All these are services that are typical that an Eved does for his master. And therefore, if he does any of these things for a person, that effectuates the acquisition. Amar Rabbi Shimon, Noteh chazaka gedola mehagbaha, shagbaha kona bechol makom. Now Rabbi Shimon adds, it's not clear what he's saying, It's saying chazakah should not be greater than lifting, because lifting something works in all cases. If you lift, lift a movable item, lift anything, that's a way of acquiring it. So chazakah shouldn't be greater than hagbaha. Now we wonder, my kamar, what is he saying? What is Rabbi Shimon adding to Tanakama? Tanakama already said that if he does any of these things, or if the slave lifts up the master, then that is an act of acquisition, that the master acquires a slave through that. So Rabbi Shimon says, hagbaha should be stronger than chazakah. But Tanakama agreed to that. So what exactly is he saying? Amar Rav Asher, higbiho hu l'rabo kena'o, higbiho rabo lo kena'o. Amar Rabbi Shimon, lo te chazakah gedola ma'hagbaha, shagbaha kona b'chol makom. Rav Asher explains that according to Tanakama, if the slave lifted the master, then the master acquires the slave, because that's an act of hazakah. If I tell my slave, pick me up, right, and he picks me up, so I'm using the slave, he is serving me, and that shows that I have acquired him. However, if the master picks up the slave, that doesn't work. If I go and pick up a cup, pick up a piece of fruit, those things I'm acquiring by picking up. But why would a master pick up a slave? This is an act of hardship. That's work. So a master picking up a slave does not have him get acquired. That's the opinion of Tanakama. To that, Rabbi Shimon comes and argues, no, it doesn't make sense. Hazakah should not be greater than lifting, because lifting acquires in any situation. Anytime I have something and I want to acquire, I pick it up. So according to Rabbi Shimon, both ways, if either the master picks up the slave, he acquires him through hagbaha. If the slave picks up the master, then also the master acquires the slave through hazakah. Now that we agree that if a slave picks up a master, that is a way that the master acquires the slave through chazakah. So the same should be true for shivcha kana'anit. Not only if the shivcha kana'anit physically lifts up the owner, but even, let's say, they have bi'ah, missionary style, such that he is on top of her. So at that point, she is, in a sense, lifting him, and so that could be chazakah. So then we should add bi'ah to the list. Not that it's being acquired through bi'ah, the way a groom acquires a bride through bi'ah, but rather just the fact that she is lifting him up, that would be an acquisition. So why don't we add that? We say no. No, we only say that lifting someone up acquires him when the person who's being lifted, the master, he benefits from it. He doesn't have to, push himself, exert himself, and the slave who's picking him up is exerting himself and suffers his hard work. That is when, that shows that he is working as a slave. Whereas if they have bi'ah, then both of them are enjoying it. She's enjoying it. That's not working as a slave. That doesn't show ownership. And so that's why it's no good. Okay, what about strange question? What if the master is having relation shelo kedarka, where she is not enjoying it, and he is on top of her, so she is kind of lifting him? So would that be a form of acquisition? So who said she's not enjoying that? Maybe both of them have enjoyment, and therefore that's not considered an act of acquisition. It's only if she's showing that she is a slave by doing work that makes her suffer, picking him up or doing whatever for him. And so this is not necessarily true, that but maybe both of them do benefit from it. Furthermore, the pasuk says the ways of lying with a woman, which means that they're both the same. Any laws that are true for one are true for the other. And since regular bi'ah is not a form of acquisition, so too bi'ah shelo kedarka will not be an act of hazakah, and will not acquire her. Next, we conclude with a story. Rabbi Yehuda Hindu Ager She'en Lo Yorshin Hava. There was a Rabbi Yehuda from India. He was a convert. He had no heirs. The law with about someone that had no heirs is that once he dies, all his property becomes hefker. Anyone can come and take it. Now, halash, he became sick. Al Mozutra l'shayulebe. Mozutra comes to visit him. Amazing, this convert was able to achieve the level of status of being an Amorah, having Mozutra come and visit him. Chaziyat takif le alma tuba. And Mozutra sees that he was very, very sick. He's on his deathbed, and it's going to be any moment now. Amar le'abdeh shelof li mesanai ve'amtinhu lebeta. So Mozutra, I'm sure he cared about his friend a lot, but at the same time, he also is thinking about the slave, and he wants to acquire Rabbi Yehuda Hindu's slave, so that as soon as Rabbi Yehuda dies, the slave won't be acquired by someone else or gain his own freedom. And so Mozutra says, "Can you take off my shoe and take off my shoes and take them to my house?" We saw already taking off one's shoes is a way of hazakah, and go to my house is something that'll take a while. So in the meantime, if Rabbi Yehuda Hindu dies, the slave will already be in the middle of doing something on behalf of Mozutra, and that will be a hazakah, and Mozutra will automatically gain ownership of the slave. So that's the story. There's two ways of interpreting the story. Some say that the slave was an adult. Now, a slave who's an adult, when the master dies and there's no heirs, he acquires his own freedom, right? So normally what would happen is that this slave would just go and be free. But Mozutra wanted to preempt that, and so had him do an act of slavery, so an act of chazakah, at the same time that his master was dying, such that the moment that Rabbi Yehuda died, the slave would not get his own freedom, but transfer immediately to Mozutra's ownership. So Rabbi Yehuda departed to death, and Mozutra, he departed to life, meaning he received a slave, and so he benefited from Rabbi Yehuda's death, and also by this strategy by which he could acquire something through chazakah. That's why the story is here. Others say that this slave was a minor, and Mozutra did not agree with the opinion of Abba Shaul in the following braita that says, a convert who dies, and then the other Jews come and they plunder his property. Everybody goes and grabs, and this one takes his shirt, and this one takes his house. And among the things were avadim. Now, whether they are adults or minors, they acquire themselves, right? They're walking around, they have their own minds, and therefore no one can just go and grab them. Since they have minds of their own, they can, and they're hefker, right? So since they are hefker, they get first dibs to themselves, right? And they say, "Oh, he died, I'm free." So that's according to the Tanakama. However, Abba Shaul says, if they're adults, they acquire themselves. But if they're children, they don't have a proper mindset to be able to acquire themselves. And therefore, if they're children, anyone who goes and grabs them first will be able to take them. Therefore, if the slave in the story was a minor and we followed Abba Shaul, he wouldn't have to do the strategy, because the katan does not get his own ownership once the master died. So Mozutra could have waited till the Yehuda, the convert, died, and then after he died, he could have went and grabbed the minor slave and had him. He wouldn't have to do this whole strategy of take off my shoes and go to my house. Therefore, it could be that it was a katan, but Mozutra did not follow Abba Shaul, or rather Tanakama that says an adult or a minor will acquire themselves. That's why he had to do the strategy. So there's two ways to understand it. You can understand this way, or the first way that says it was an adult. And if it was an adult, then Mozutra could be following either Tanakama or Abba Shaul, because they agree that an adult would acquire himself as soon as the master died, and therefore he had to do the strategy and have this adult be in the middle of servicing Mozutra, so that as soon as the owner died, Mozutra would acquire them through Hazakah. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.